Powell's legacy is Michael Allen, an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. Professor, thanks for being with us here. You know, Powell was one of those rare figures that seemed to have the admiration of both political parties. In this political age, what do you think it was about his style, his personality that gave him that kind of cachet?
Well, he was a consummate soldier, statesman who had devoted his life to the service of his country in a way that sort of transcended party politics by and large, although not always. And I think that that commands respect among many Americans, although I guess I would say that, certainly Colin Powell had come in for his share of criticism at various points in his career.
And that's it. He was praised for so much of his career, but clearly facing a lot of criticism, in the case of going to war with Iraq. So talk about his legacy and what you think will really stand out as we remember him through the years.
Well, I think that certainly his legacy is a complicated one, and it should begin with, as you noted in opening this segment, that he was the first Black senior statesman to occupy the role of Secretary of State, and before that, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and National Security Advisor. And all of those are really pioneering accomplishments on his part. I think beyond that, he symbolizes the way in which the U.S. military and the Army in particular reacted and adjusted to the U.S. Experience in Vietnam and America's defeat in that war. Much of his career was defined by trying to reinvent the use of armed force in the world after the Vietnam War, and that really culminated in the Persian Gulf War and was regarded as a success. That being said, his support for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think, will stand as a major black mark on his record, and he acknowledged as much, in fact, after leaving the Bush White House in 2004.
Yeah, he did, in fact, call that a blot on his own career. How would you describe his rapport with so many American presidents?
Well, I think it was a strong sort of kind of rapport that was founded in his sense of service and duty. He had a record of working closely and successfully with presidents of both parties. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs under the first President Bush, but also remained in that role under President Clinton, and then, of course, served the second President Bush. That being said, he was also willing to make his differences and distance from presidential policies known, such as when he opposed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that the Clinton administration implemented, and also later when he was fairly clear about his differences with George W. Bush over the war in Iraq. And that is ultimately what led Bush to ask for his resignation in 2004. And so, he worked closely and respectfully and constructively with presidents from both parties over 15, 20 years, but often, sort of felt a bit of friction with some of those presidents that he served.
It's not easy to do. You talk about how he straddled the fence in politics, moving, of course, further left in his later career. It's really difficult.
Well, I would actually dispute that. I don't think he moved at all. I think what happened is that the Republican Party moved to the right, and he ultimately found himself out of step with where it headed. Powell was always a middle-of-the-road centrist, and that put him in the kind of mainstream of the Republican Party under the first President Bush. But in this century, he found himself more at odds with where his party went. And ultimately, he supported President Obama and then President Biden over the last 12 years. And I think that makes clear his own unease with the direction his party headed.
Well, we talked a lot about he was a man of ideals and was attributed an awful lot of wisdom and sayings throughout his life and career. Do you have a favorite Colin Powell saying, and why is that?
Well, I think his most famous saying is, if you break it, you buy it, or if you break it, you own it, in reference to the invasion of Iraq. And I think that will ultimately sort of stick with most people when they think about Colin Powell. I suppose if there's a favorite saying of his, it would be that for me, because it is very wise. I mean, it reflects the hard-won wisdom of his military career, which began with him being a second lieutenant in the Vietnam War, and he learned a lot from that experience, I think. But ultimately, those lessons were not able to, I think, restrain the push for war in Iraq in the 2000s. And, I think that if the people in the Bush administration that he had been working with had paid more heed to that advice, that a lot of hardship and death could have been avoided.
Yeah. He was a war hero and a human who was willing to admit his faults and mistakes. Dr. Michael Allen from Northwestern, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well,